Welcome to Cancel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Cancel Culture, the Business of Law podcast. Happy New Year to all the listeners. We hope you had a really good break. And a restful one at that. I think the end of 2024 was really hectic for everybody. I think it's a good start to the new year. And I'm joined today by Beth Durkin, Associate Director with us. Hello, Beth.
Hi, Meg.
It's good to have you back on the podcast. It's been a while, and we've got some nice kind of business level stories to go through today. It's been a fairly quiet period over Christmas, but there have been a few interesting features actually coming out in the last couple of weeks. So should we dig in?
Yeah, great. Thanks for inviting me on to kick off the first pod of 2025.
Yes, exciting. All right, let's go into the first story, which broke, I think it was earlier this week or last week. KPMG is seeking kind of an ABS structure in Arizona to become the first of the big four to kind of have a legal arm in the US, which is really, really interesting. And I think it's a big move. And I think they've got their review next week on the 14th of January. So there's definitely going to be more on that. Obviously, KPMG's had a legal arm in the UK for a while and has been quite successful. They've made quite some successful hires in the last few years. And ABS is nothing new in the UK. We've had those structures for a decade, maybe, something like that. What are your thoughts on this move?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think with anything in the big four where one kind of breaks away and does something before the others, that's interesting in itself. But
it's a power move.
It's a power move, and obviously US market is a huge prize. I think we all understand the appeal. But yeah. I think it's interesting that it's over 10 years now since I think most of the big four entered the UK legal market. I think it was back in 2014 and Deloitte a bit later. I wonder whether this is kind of an opportunity to do the same model in the US or whether they'll actually approach it differently given the size of the market. Because I think there was a lot of fears in the UK when the big four accountancy practices started offering legal services that it would be a really disruptive force.
That was the talk of town for literally 5 years. Everyone was like, "Oh my God, what would you expect from this?"
Yeah, there's real fears they would take big market shares, particularly from kind of mid-market firms. And I don't think those have been borne out. I think it's there's been space for everyone at the table. So whether that will be the same in the US or not is an interesting question. Just because of the size of the market, will they find the same kind of structure works in terms of, I think they rely quite heavily on referrals from within the firm.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting play. I think whether others will follow suit quickly or wait and see is probably the big question.
I think they'll probably wait to see what happens with the next steps of getting that license. If it's successful in the first place, I think that's the biggest hurdle so far. If it is, I'm sure the others will be looking very closely as to kind of how they're doing in the US. But I'm a bit confused by this because I feel like, is it going to be only operating in Arizona, or is that a way to actually expand into other states? I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, the state-by-state approach is an interesting feature in the market. I think it is a platform from which they can advise more broadly, but it depends on Arizona's own rules. I think that's why it's Arizona they've gone for. I think everyone will be kind of watching to see how that unfolds. And actually, as you say, the operational questions in itself are quite interesting for how they organise the business.
Absolutely, and how that's going to, even impact their kind of auditing side of things. Do they have to change the partnership agreement to accommodate this new model, whatever it's going to look like? So I think the details of, what the license actually will allow and how they're going to arrange that side of the business will be really, really interesting. Are they going to share the profit pool? There's just so many questions there, I think, to answer. So we'll definitely be looking out for the next developments in this. But I'm surprised that nobody's had reactions from the market so far. I've not seen a single story with, even off-record quotes from other people to see how how it's perceived so far. And I'd be interested to see what people are saying, what they're thinking, whether they're like, oh, well, another one in the market, whatever, especially because in the US, there's so many law firms already. Like, I think a lot of them will just be like, yeah, it doesn't really affect us. But yeah, I'd be interested to see what others are saying in comparison to what the reaction was like in the UK.
I think the big question is next week when the state rules on the application. I think that will be when we might see more market reaction. But yeah, definitely an interesting story to see how that unfolds this year.
Yeah. Next up, so there was a Horizon by Katie Dowell and the lawyer, which talked all about kind of the rates that the firms are billing to their clients. And they had some interesting statistics there. The first one being that 66% of in-house lawyers who responded to their survey think that the increase in rates is unsustainable. However, less than 47% of them questioned law firm bills over the last year. So clearly we can see that, people agree on, in general, that, it's kind of in the long term, I think especially in the UK, because I'm not sure that was asked across the pond, but especially in the UK, I think it's a lot of people are agreeing that it's kind of, not really sustainable, I guess, for their own business, but also for the in-house teams, obviously. But that did not translate necessarily in a huge increase in them questioning. And also the way the statistic came out, it's unclear whether the questioning was just a general thing of, oh, it's a bit more expensive than it was last year, but whatever, we'll still pay it. Or if it was a case of going item by item in the bill and being like, no, I'm not happy with this. Can you remove this? Or, can we negotiate a different price? So that's a bit blurry to me. What were your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think obviously law firm rates is kind of the flip side of the coin to the salaries story.
For sure.
That was such a big journey through 2024 in the market. And I think it's natural that having seen salaries rise, questions will turn for the clients that pay the rates that support those salaries, what's their perspective? I mean, whether it is actually unsustainable, I'm actually not sure about, because I think if you think of the context that GCs are operating in, it's got massively more complex, that there's more challenges coming if we think about globalization, kind of geopolitical tension, impact of technology and how disruptive that's going to be, maybe more regulatory pressure on things like climate. They're going to be just new questions. I think in that environment, expertise is essential.
Yeah. And there's no price on that.
Exactly. Can you put a price on that? Yes. So I suspect we haven't yet seen the ceiling of law firm rates going up and probably salaries attached to that. So it's an interesting question. I mean, let's see whether there is more kind of client pressure that starts to be felt and whether that is a break on some of this kind of salary growth that we've seen. But I think given the pressures that are kind of shaping the business environment, I'd be amazed if we have seen the ceiling.
Oh, I don't believe for a second that we have. I mean, I expect, in the next few months, in the next 6 months, I expect, salaries to go up again and again and again. I mean, I don't think it's going to end. Yeah. And I think in the way that, I think for a lot of businesses, a lot of companies, it will be unsustainable and they will start relying on their own resources in-house or on other technologies or some, alternative providers that are not as expensive. So I think for a lot of, it depends who you are, I guess, as a business, we were talking about this earlier, but if you're a big tech company, even I don't think that will ever be unsustainable for them, but also even if it was, I don't think they would ever kind of flinch about the price that they're putting on this. If you're a big tech company that faces litigation constantly across the world, or where there's regulation that will impact you in so many ways, you just have to invest to make sure that your consumers are protected at all times. So, I guess it depends who you are as a business. But it's interesting to me. I would question not so much the billings, but more kind of how they're actually how the firms are using these billings and like what they're investing towards if I was the client. Because to me, I think a lot of it in London in particular, I think we're seeing a lot more reliance when there's partner moves and team moves on the use of guarantees that are really long and really expensive that you don't really necessarily see in the US as much. And I just wonder, paying trainees and associates quite high, some of them argue it's not really justified, but I think more importantly is at partner level when they're moving, even for the law firms, is it sustainable to have a partner move in and have them on $5 million a year for 5 years, and does that actually translate into more work and more billings, or so I think that's more of the way I would question it. Is it actually worth it? I'm not sure. Do you get better advice for it? I'm not sure.
Well, I think that's the nub of the challenge, isn't it? It's fundamentally a communication challenge.
Yeah.
Of how you position your expertise, how you communicate the services, what's included, how you do your pricing, the brand that underpins the credibility of all of that.
For sure.
So interconnected. It's actually a big question of how law firms kind of price their services and then structure that charge to clients. As you say, we might see innovation in kind of pricing and moving to more sort of fixed term models, fixed cost models. That would be interesting in terms of, because then we're back to operations and how law firms manage their cash flow. But yeah, fundamentally, I think rising rates is a communication problem because you need to get your clients on board with why.
Yeah.
Build trust that it's necessary, it's needed, and it's the right thing for them to do, rather than look at cheaper providers, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I understand the pressures on law firms to put up their rates. There's, new innovation like technology doesn't come cheap. It's going to be transformative. You need to stay abreast of that. You can't be left behind.
Exactly. I think the technology point is interesting because I was talking about it with another client recently, but they were saying, you're introducing this new product that no one else has, so you can put any price tag on it realistically in the first few years, but once the other catch up, and when the technology actually changes, in 10 years time, the technology you've implemented now will be completely, past its date. And at that point, you can't charge the same rate for it as you do today. And I just think it's interesting how you have to change the pricing of that technology you're using as well, alongside, especially if it's AI, because it just moves so quickly how they're developing it and using it for different purposes. So I think it's just really interesting because, you're using an AI chatbot now and you can price it for however much, but then, in 5 years' time, that will be so outdated. Is it going to be made redundant at that point? Can you even price it at that point? I'm not entirely sure. So, it's just even in the long term, I think this is really a difficult challenge to communicate, I think, internally and with clients and have those conversations.
Lots of big questions for the start of the new year.
Yeah, for sure. So definitely one to watch. I mean, again, I'm sure salary season is coming up soon. So I'm sure we'll see some more bumps coming through in the next, even bonuses coming through in the next quarter, if not the next 6 months. I'm sure the clients will not necessarily be happy, but will they actually go against that? I'm not convinced. Let's move on to the next one. It was a feature by Caroline Byrne at Law.com, which was actually really interesting and looked kind of at the impact of private equity investment into the legal industry a bit everywhere. So that kind of stemmed from a recent case in Germany where, obviously in the EU, because of EU rules, a lot of jurisdictions, if not, I think most of them, don't allow for private equity investors or other types of investors to actually invest in law firms. Obviously, that's not the case in the UK, and Australia has been like that for a while. So it kind of raises a lot of questions as to why there's such a difference and what is justified in the EU versus the UK, how things are going across jurisdictions with those types of investments, and how, if you don't have access to that kind of private equity money, what are your options? What did you think of the piece, Beth?
Yeah, I think it's, again, big questions, really interesting. Gets to the heart of really, I think, how law firms as businesses can sort of raise large amounts of capital that's probably going to be needed to fund some of this investment and development of new technology and disruption that we've been predicting for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, the case in the EU I found really interesting. It sort of hinged on, I think, that question of if lawyers are beholden to shareholders who have a purely financial interest in the business, will that potentially risk their loyalty to their clients and that sense of integrity and client first?
Yeah.
I mean, given as you said, alternative business structures have been a thing in the UK and Australia and elsewhere for a while, like over a decade. I'm not sure whether those fears are necessarily founded, but I think it's a really important question. I'm not quite sure how does it necessarily diverge from a partner's duty to their fellow partners. I probably see it in a similar light. But I think it's really important to kind of ask those questions as we see law firms kind of look to transform. I mean, I think the other question it opens is if there are barriers to accessing capital in this way, will we see law firms maybe look back to things like IPOs that haven't really taken off in the way that I think a couple of years ago people thought they might?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Mishcon de Reya was thinking of listing, was it 2-3 years ago now? And obviously that didn't happen. And the market's been kind of difficult, I think, the market conditions, at least worldwide, but at least in the UK, and it looks like it's starting to change. But I think you need a lot more stability and reassurance. And I think you need like normal corporates to actually list again. En masse to actually for some firms to consider that again, and I don't think that's going to be anytime soon. But it's interesting. I mean, you could look at the firms that have listed. How are they doing? Was it successful? If not, why? And what can they do next? Should they delist as a result? There's so many questions around, and I think it's quite a difficult. I think it's a difficult process, and I think even just it takes so long to even consider listing. I think there's so many things to think about, and so many people internally to convince that is the right thing to do. Because at the end of the day, it's partners' money, right? So, if they know they're going to get richer, then I guess they'll be like, yeah, great. But it is also a risk for a long time, especially if you know that. I think for people who list, I think there's a clause for partners to stay for longer. For a certain part of the time. I think for DWF, for example, I think they had a clause like that. So it's interesting. Do partners actually want to stay for that long? What if the investment actually isn't worth it 5 years down the line? So I think it's really difficult. And yeah, in the PE investments as well in the UK, we've seen a few. It's hard to tell how that's gone. I think for some of them, we know it's not gone so well, but for some others, it might have gone okay. And, at that point, it's not so much as a partner, I think it's not so much your responsibility to make sure the business is afloat, but you've got a responsibility to someone else. And I think for a lot of people, it's difficult to manage. There might be conflicting interests in that. And I think it's the same. We're seeing that with, some litigation funders as well, where obviously they're responding to a higher kind of asset management company or whatnot. And I think this is really difficult to kind of navigate that landscape. So yeah, it was a really interesting piece.
I think the other kind of aspect of it is that there's that question of being beholden. There's that question about how you access capital. I think there's also that question kind of underpinning both of those of how law firms grow. And I think that's where the involvement of private equity could be really interesting, because obviously private equity houses,
they've got cash, and
the whole reason for being is buy a business, grow it.
It's the quick way to access.
I do wonder whether more involvement of private equity would actually kind of unlock, not lessons, but kind of unlock new ways of seeing maybe faster law firm growth. I mean, traditionally, I think firms kind of quite quickly look to build at scale as a means of unlocking growth. And I don't know if that's going to be sustainable in the long term. That there's been a lot of conversation about we're going to see more consolidation as firms chase growth in the past years. And I don't think we have seen that. So it's our firms looking for other ways to do it, and could lessons and kind of insight from outside the sector from places like investors be a route to find it? Maybe. So I think it'll be interesting whether more firms do look to tap into private equity as a way to maybe try some of this.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the moment, mergers and acquisitions is kind of the primary way they're thinking about it. But obviously, there's so many constraints with that, and again, so many considerations, and it takes a long time as well. So I think if you want, quick cash injection for a particular, business need, I think P might be the way to go. But I think it's not without difficulties. And I think it's the EU case again is interesting because they were quite adamant on the ruling, but I wonder if that's gonna if that's gonna change over time, because at the moment a lot of EU firms are kind of constrained to their current system. But no doubt they would want to expand as well at some point. Maybe not now, but they might look to. And I think that's if you don't have those options on the table, it's much harder to do it, because then I guess you're limited to M&A, which might not be ideal for your business. So I wonder if we'll see a change in rules at some point in the EU, if it means attracting investments. Fascinating story. Last one, it was again a horizon from Katie Dowell, the lawyer, and it was all about kind of how the last year has kind of reshaped the legal industry globally, and obviously we've seen quite a lot of things between Paul Weiss' impressive growth in London in just 18 months, and the A&O Sherman tie-up, the HSF Kramer Levin tie-up as well, which is going to formally come into place this year. Just I think last week, Clyde's announced a tie-up with the Texas firm. So there's definitely movement, definitely movement, and obviously I think the US is the key to reshaping that order. We've seen firms also close in their offices in certain jurisdictions for a variety of reasons. So I think it's definitely, things are changing. And I think in 10 years time, the kind of tables of the UK top 100 and what that's going to change massively. I think we won't really recognize.
Do you think so?
I think so. 10 years? I think so. I don't think in the US side, like the AMLO 100, I don't think that's going to change massively. But I do think the UK side of things, that's going to look very different. That's what I think. But, I could be wrong.
I'm not convinced, but we'll see.
Interesting. Why not?
I think that certainly on the UK side, the market has been very stable. I think at the top of that list, we've seen firms adding scale with the sort of bolt-ons, but I don't think we've seen a kind of really transformational merger between those firms in that bracket. I'm not sure that any of them would consider it a big change. Maybe I'm wrong, but no, I think the market will be more stable. I think it's a question, as you say, of the US being key. Will we see firms making more of a US play? I think that's the change we'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to someone today, actually, who was saying that, with the new administration coming through in the US, a lot of the US firms will be thinking of their options, because for them, it's unclear whether that's going to mean disruptions to the markets or stability yet. And for a lot of them, they might think, well, actually, we need to bring in that international element now. And it's whether they can actually do that. So it's just really, it's fascinating. I think that the geopolitical element to it for the next 4 years will be an added challenge, and maybe it's going to create lots of opportunities. To be fair, we don't know. So
change is normally an opportunity in the legal sector. It goes back to expertise being really valuable in that context. I mean, whether we'll see kind of a retreat from globalization, or whether firms will respond to domestic changes by pivoting more to globalization, I'm not sure. It'll probably vary by firm. But that question of kind of who are the new global elite and who will that be in the next 10 years, I think is really interesting, because I think what's underpinning that is that maybe we're looking at slightly different metrics.
For sure. And I think, quite often, I think a lot of publications and firms between themselves, when they do competitor analysis and things like that, they're limited to the available financial data that's provided by the firms, and just, number of offices and the number of lawyers, like all that kind of data. But actually, there's so much more that could make you elite. That's not necessarily quantified that way. And sometimes it might not even come from figures. It might come from feedback from clients or, staff members. And, you might be elite in terms of your own culture, but not necessarily have a $5 billion revenue. I think it's very, it depends what you prioritize, I guess, as a business. And I guess for the publications reporting on these things too, it really depends what you think elite means to you. And I think that has a very particular and subjective meaning to each person. And it's interesting when you have conversations with, managing partners and stuff. Some of them are very keen on very particular issues. Some of them will be just all about money and that kind of stuff. And for them, it's clear that you're not elite if you don't build this much and whatever else. But for some of them, it's very much about the people. And that definition to me is just really fascinating, that we're trying to have a global elite kind of mindset and rankings and things like that. And I'm like, well, if you're small but you're excellent at what you do, and so Torrey, for example, they don't need to have an office everywhere, and they don't need to have 1,000 lawyers, and do you know what I mean? They don't need all of this to actually be considered elite in their market, and especially in the M&A space. Do you know what I mean? So I think that if you have an expertise that, that whatever big corporate is definitely going to be speed dialing you when they've got an issue, I think that kind of makes you elite. So I think it's just really interesting, that whole conversation. It's been going on for months among the legal trades, where all of a sudden, I don't know, there's been a reckoning, a moment of, realization, what's happening, who's the best. And
well, I think it's a product of that definite shift that we've seen of the US firms kind of coming over to London, and New York and London becoming kind of, for many firms, a bit of an axis that their business operates on, which I don't think is surprising in terms of, if you look at where the international financial centres are, and the benefits of time zones and things like that, it's natural to gravitate towards those cities. But I think what is interesting is the way the work is kind of being concentrated in those, and a bit of retreat, as you say, firms closing offices, a bit of a pooling effect rather than seeking scale, and planting lots of flags in places. And the way that interacts with that conversation of, okay, well, it's not really a question of biggest anymore. When we say elite, it used to be big equals elite, and now, I think that's the key change. Now we're looking at, I'd say, more nuanced metrics of who is their client base, what kind of work are they doing, who are they recruiting, what's the culture. It's a much more complicated question. But it's interesting, and I do think that market is changing a lot. I mean, the impact of A&O and Sherman Sterling merging, what's the new firm going to bring to the table is going to be one of the big questions we have for 2025. Will we see more UK-US tie-ups as a result? Maybe. I mean,
I'm sure the others are looking for opportunities. Whether that materializes is a different question, but I think for the UK firms, it's clear that they want to break the US market. And I think the best way to do it is, some of them have tried with key hires, which has gone really well for them. But I think there is a next step to that as well. If you really want to actually compete with the big players there. So it's a fascinating thing. I even when you could just consider the cultural differences between UK and US firms, where UK firms, were planting flags everywhere, across, Asia, the Middle East and whatnot. And the US firms have historically been a lot more cautious with that approach, and they will plant flags, but not necessarily everywhere all at once. And now you're seeing a lot of UK firms kind of retreating from some markets because it's not as profitable or whatever it is. So it's sometimes less is more. So it's just really interesting. It's an exciting year ahead. I'm actually excited to see what's going to happen in the market. How about you?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that's probably the theme of of this conversation. Lots of big questions.
Yeah.
Wait and see.
A lot to think about. Yeah.
maybe later in the year we can look back and see if we've got any of the answers.
Yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. Yeah, I'll see you back in December and have a recap of, well, were we right? But yeah, no, I think we're coming to the end of the podcast, guys. So thank you for listening. We will be back next week for another episode. Beth, thank you for coming onto the episode today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you want to listen to us. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.